I wanted to just start by welcoming Dr. Ortega. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Suzanne Ortega to UTSA today to kick off our series on current issues impacting graduate education. I'm so privileged to host her today. Sorry, I'm just I do apologize. I lost internet connectivity for a little bit. So I was just saying I'm privileged to host her today since she has served as a role model and mentor to me in my life as a graduate school dean. She's a strong champion of education, particularly of graduate education. So a little bit of background about Dr. Ortega. She serves as president of the Council of Graduate Schools, CGS, which is the only US higher education association which is devoted solely to graduate study. CGS has nearly 500 US and Canadian members and 29 international affiliates. A sociologist by training, Dr. Ortega's research focuses on social inequality, mental health, and graduate education. Prior to assuming her current position, she served from 2011 to 2014 as a senior vice president for academic affairs at the University of North Carolina. Her previous appointments included the executive vice president and provost at the University of New Mexico, vice provost and graduate dean at the University of Washington, as well as the University of Missouri. The author of numerous articles and book chapters, Dr. Ortega's master's and doctoral degrees in sociology were completed at Vanderbilt University. She has served on review panels for NSF and NIH. She has been the principal investigator or co-investigator on grants totaling more than 12 million in state, federal, and private foundation funds. Dr. Ortega has served on a number of professional association boards and committees, including the GRE, the National Academies of Science, Committee on Revitalizing Graduate STEM Education for the 21st Century, and the National Science Foundation's Human Resources Expert Panel. In addition, she is currently a board member of the American University of the Emirates, serves on advisory councils for the Vanderbilt University Graduate School, and the Society's Consortium on Sexual Harassment in STEM. With that, welcome, Dr. Ortega.
Ambika, thanks so much for your kind invitation. It really is a pleasure to spend time with my colleagues at UTSA talking about a world that seems to be changing faster than we could ever have imagined. I was thinking that within a month, it will be precisely a year that travel to meetings, travel to the office ceased as we adopted a new mode of thinking and working and producing science together and individually. And, you know, I think in some ways it seems like a totally different world. And yet the trends that the pandemic, that the racial violence, that the threats to democracy over the past year have simply amplified the trends I really want to talk about that are much longer term trends, trends driven by technology, by demography, by generational differences that are producing a real difference in the way we will work together. So I really want to talk to you today about some of the things I see that have been ongoing, probably for about 20 years, and some of the new changes or things that have accelerated, and then to start thinking through together, what do we as graduate faculty members, as graduate students, as graduate administrators owe to one another to think about deeply in making sure that we are creating the spaces in graduate education for our students to master the skills they'll need for what I'll now call late 21st century work. So next slide, John, please. There's really just three things I want you to take away, major points. And I think I've probably mostly made them, that demographic, technological, and economic trends are changing the mix of students we serve, and the careers and the leadership for which they must prepare. I want to go on to make the case that to be successful in this changing environment, there are some core, I'll call them intellectual skills that will be necessary to thrive. And these are interdisciplinarity, multicultural competence, ethics, and I would actually make the case ethics, particularly in the context of large data sets, collaboration, communication, and intellectual risk-taking will all be more important than ever. And finally, I want to turn our attention and discussion really, and I hope it is a discussion, to what, if you believe any of these things to be true, and you certainly can quarrel with me, and I hope we'll engage in a conversation about that as well. But if you believe any of these things to be true, what are the implications for how we teach, how we mentor our students? How do we think not just about professional development, but about the kinds of curricular requirements, capstone projects, dissertations to be specific, that we will ask them to prepare? So let me just move to the next slide and do a really quick run through of what I see, not as the only trends, but as ones I think that we really need to call out and hold in the back of our minds. As you all know, there are tremendous demographic shifts at both the global, national, and certainly our regional levels over the past few decades. International migration is at levels perhaps never before seen in the world. I think in 2015, the estimates were that 244 million individuals lived outside of their birth country. That number would make them one of the largest countries in the world just by virtual mass of population. Generational differences, specifically the difference between digital natives and those of us who have come to the highly digital world as adults, have different communication styles, different preferences for ways for interacting, which signal a real need to attention about the intergenerational context of communication and how we clearly communicate expectations across these different modalities and different preferences. Of course, it is also a generation marked by increased access to higher education for groups that have been historically excluded, persons of color, persons from racially and ethnically underrepresented groups, low-income students, indigenous persons, rural women in some parts of the country, indeed in parts of our country as well. So all of these dynamics, who are our students and what set of cultural expectations and background understandings and orientations do they bring to us, is certainly one context that's shaping the way we should and must be thinking about graduate education. Of course, it goes without saying that we've lived our whole last year on Zoom. In fact, it's sort of feeling second nature, like you're shocked when you wait 30 seconds before you get on and you can't. I mean, it's just the way technology has changed in our interactions. But I want to suggest, and most of you know, that it's not just the way we meet with one another, it's the way we build community with one another. It's the way in which we actually produce our research and scholarship. Many of you will have had the experience of working with students whose laboratory research was disrupted and trying to find an alternative mechanism for allowing them to continue data collection. I mean, much of this has driven, I think, a real renewed reliance on large data sets and computational methods, as opposed to the kind that is basically bench science and derivative of first level primary data. And so this level of technology and technology brokered interactions is really changing not only the conduct of research, but the way in which we will collaborate. Ultimately, I expect that it will change the content of degrees as well. We already from data from our alumni see alumni 8 and 3 years out really talking about the importance of additional computational and digital literacies and preparation that fields that did not once rely on substantial statistical techniques increasingly do so. And I want to make the point, it's not new. This trend has been going on at least since the early 2000s, but it has escalated in response to a crisis that asked us to find new ways to do science. Of course, big data is not a technology, and I wouldn't pretend to tell you I fully grappled or understood the whole notion of machine learning and artificial intelligence, or even the implications of 5G. But here are more technologies that will alter not only what our students need to learn to do their work, but it will alter the way in which education is delivered. I saw one recent article, it came from Deborah Stewart in conjunction with her colleagues at NORC, that really speculates that one of the lasting legacies we can almost be sure is that more and more of our graduate courses will be delivered either in hybrid mechanisms or fully online. Again, and I would drill down to ask the question, what do we know about the nature of mentoring relationships, of building networks and communications that link our students to the broader community when we deliver education in this way. But even in terms of basic research, the way our work is produced, how it's funded, is fundamentally changing. I would make the case that it is far more interdisciplinary, in part because so much of the money to support research is what I will call mission-driven. It is focused around solving a problem, cancer, for instance, groundwater contamination, for instance, as opposed to deep explorations of the fundamental mechanisms of the cell or something. So as a bulk, you're getting much more mission and problem-focused research. That actually means that bigger and bigger teams, often international teams, are producing that work, which also requires a different kind of skill set. And we all know how much more competitive the research grant environment has become. Whole nother dynamic. I guess the bottom line for me is I was stunned. This was 10 years ago when I was told that 40% of the freshmen entering my university at that time would have jobs. 40% of the freshmen would have jobs that did not exist on the day that they matriculated. And if you figure out the shelf life of basic biomedical research, you keep thinking, what in the world are we going to test people on at the end of the semester when we taught them something so different at the beginning? So I hope I've convinced you that work is changing. Let me just give you a few more facts. We'll just move to the next slide, please, John. Just a little bit more about the changing nature of work. There is good reason to expect that we will describe late 21st century careers as portfolio careers practiced in a project-based economy. And let me tell you why I say that. We know that even 5 years ago, the typical job entrant, the Bureau of Labor Statistics said, could expect to have 11 jobs over the course of their lifetime and 3 distinct career changes. So not just the same job, but work jumping from one company to a next, but a real orthogonal shift in the way we do our work. It's also the case, and I'm going to show you a little bit of data down the road from a project we're doing, that careers are less unidirectional, that the boundaries between academic and business, government, nonprofit work are more permeable. There's lots of reasons for that, but I remember when I was a graduate student, my advisor said, Suzanne, if you want to go to work for Department of Health, HHS, that's great. But don't go there first if you ever want to have a faculty job, because you won't be able to move from an agency to a faculty position. That simply isn't the case anymore. And there are good reasons why those borders are more fluid, but it challenges us to think about the distinction we often have in the back of our mind: preparation for an academic career versus preparation for and it's often called alternative careers. So we know that this is the case. We know that people will work for single companies far less frequently than they do. Some folks call this the project-based economy, that will work for an employer with a cluster of people around a particular project until that project is completed. And then we will be redeployed to work with a different cluster of people around a different product. And I think when you start thinking about what that means, what skill sets will it take for an individual to wind up a project, move to a next project, and figure out how they plug in and how they complement the work of a variety of others who bring a variety of different perspectives. We really need to think differently about what those skill sets are. Well, I do want to give you a few data points. I won't belabor them, but I promise you I will make the slides available if you want to study them and then you have questions. But let's turn to the next slide. And these are data from a very large project, a 5-year project that CGS has been conducting, including approximately 75 universities. I think there are now well over 40,000 university PhD alums in the database, nearly that many students, and we're beginning to re-interview many of them. Well, you could get these data in another way. These are data drawn from individuals who are 3 years, 8 years, and 15 years out across a variety of science and humanities domains. What you'll see in these data is actually a slightly higher percentage of people currently employed in academic positions than you might find from many studies. I expect this is partly a function. We still have an easier time finding alums who are in universities than we do finding alums who are outside of the universities. But nevertheless, you'll see that something just above 50% of our of our PhD alums are in a university setting. About a third in research universities, about another 20 to 30% in regional universities, liberal arts colleges, and elsewhere. I better get in trouble if I don't tell you our funders. This project is funded by the National Science Foundation and by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and with early support of the Sloan Foundation. So let's move to the next slide. So across fields of study, and here you're going to see the blocks of 3 columns are by discipline. I hope you can see this slide. It's a look at how much job change there is. And specifically, this slide looks at by discipline and by cohort, how many folks have changed jobs in the last 3 years. Well, it's not very surprising that at 3 years out, most people have changed. They got their job within the last 3 years, sometime following graduation. So you see the near 90, 94, 95%. Not in education, because many, I think, of the PhDs in education are pursuing educational leadership, are in positions that are seeking administrative advancement. I think what's pretty interesting is that even at 8 years out, you get more than half of the respondents having moved into a new job. You could make the argument, especially in the life sciences, that some portion of those are still making the transition out of postdoc positions. But this would be less the case in the social and behavioral sciences, or even engineering and mathematics. But pay particular attention to those who are 15 years out. At 15 years out, we still have roughly 1/3 of alums saying that they had changed jobs in the last 3 years. And I want you to have a sense of how much job mobility there is. And then let's move to just one more data slide. Next slide, John, please. Whoops, I'm sorry, I made you move, and I still want you. You were right and I was wrong. Thanks. So what I would like on this slide, I want you to note a couple things. This slide is really trying to understand the directionality of moves. Now, this is only a plot of people who've changed jobs within the last 3 years. So you're going to see that there are considerable numbers who did not change jobs. But of those who did change jobs in each of the various cohorts, most actually, no, actually, this is all job changers. What you don't see are those who changed jobs but stayed in the same sector. So if I was a university professor at University of Washington and went to New Mexico, I would not be shown on this slide because I didn't change sectors. So these are people who shifted from the academy to some other element, business, government, nonprofits, or vice versa. Now, it is much more common, clearly from these data, for you to move from the academy to a non-academic setting. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that even at 15 years out, you have a non-trivial minority of folks who have spent a career working outside of the academy, re-entering universities. And while I won't show you the data here, we do have the data that shows of those, half are moving into faculty positions, not just administrative positions. Okay, one more piece of data on jobs. And this is really, so this now is the next slide, John, thank you. And this is really a look at what we're learning from a project that we've been doing with what's called a RAPID grant, which is from NSF and is in response, trying to understand the impact of COVID on both the student pipeline and current students. Here's what we see evidence of, and it comes not only from our work, but Craig Ogilvie and his colleagues at Montana State also had a rapid survey. It is pretty clear that our current students' job orientations and interests are changing. Modestly, but changing nevertheless. There is a slight decrease in interest in academic jobs. And you could ask we don't know why. Is it because the job market seems so abysmal? Does it seem to be because there's so much in the world that needs fixing, that our students are motivated to be the change they want to be in the world? We don't know the answers to those questions, but I think it's pretty interesting to look at this sort of shifting recognition of a variety of different possibilities that might be attractive for our students and for jobs. So I hope I've convinced you now from a variety of different points of view that our students will be navigating very different kinds of careers. They're more fluid careers. They're probably not the kind of careers where you took a job as an assistant professor fresh out of graduate school and stayed there till you retired 40 or 50 years later. That the dynamics will be quite different and the nature of the work will be quite different. So that often leads us to thinking about this sort of notion, well, we have to do, of course, preparing future faculty, but we need to create this whole another set of professional development opportunities for those who don't intend, the majority who don't intend to be in academic careers. Well, I want to move at least to the next slide to challenge your thinking a little bit about this. I expect this is going to be pretty hard for you to read, but again, when you get the slide, I think you'll be able to read it. We asked our alumni in our surveys who were employed both within the university and outside of the university, a whole set of work criteria, fundamental skills that they believed were essential to their success in their current position. I could tell you more about where these skills derive from. They come from ONET and a series of Bureau of Labor statistics, but these are seen as core intellectual skills. I hope what you see is the remarkable convergence and similarity of the spider graphs in what matters to people's success, no matter where they're working. You're going to find a couple places where there's some difference. Independence is one that faculty members say is more important, somewhat more important than those working in non-government and in government settings. Um, but most of the other ones are remarkably similar. This ought to be leading us to suggest or to consider whether our strategy of bifurcated professional development or training within the curriculum makes sense if, in point of fact, skills are largely transferable and needed across all domains, which, by the way, many of our students will occupy at one point in their career or another. Well, I think there are a lot of concrete skills. We know there are. We'll get to those things like project management, leadership skills, entrepreneurship skills. There's some very specific kind of ancillary skills that our students will need. And I, under no circumstance, want to diminish the importance and the value of those, and we'll come back to them. But I do want to suggest that there are some pretty high level intellectual attributes that students will need to negotiate this shifting terrain. So if we can go to the next slide. I want to start with the notion of interdisciplinary habits of mind. Once upon a time, a colleague, a sort of crusty Ivy League humanist colleague, grumbled over a glass of wine at a meeting one night. Problem with the PhD is they've taken the pH out. And I thought, oh dear, John, I don't know if I want to have this conversation with you, because I'm not sure if you're going to tell me I need to go back and buff up on my Latin, but I'm not sure what's coming. I say this is a funny story because 20 years later, I wonder if John had a point. And his point goes something like this: to really fully respect and understand how you can be part of a multidisciplinary team, you have to have a pretty healthy understanding of what the limitations of your own perspective are. What was the historical context that led to the development of the primary paradigms in your field? Were other people's work or other approaches abandoned? Why were they abandoned? Are there unanswered questions? I mean, in sociology, which we think of as a pretty social change focused, in point of fact, the origin of the discipline is figuring out how in the world we can insist on social order in the wake of the French Revolution. So there are some really interesting tension points, and to really understand who you need to work with, you need to know who you left out. So I want to make a pretty impassioned case that our students need to understand the philosophy and history of their disciplines. Maybe they don't have to be experts, but they have to have enough sense of how their body of knowledge and how their conceptualizations can complement and augment others to be effective members of interdisciplinary teams. Make a huge pitch for the public communication of scholarship. That's where we find the greatest support for science in an increasingly science questioning society. That work, which can be effectively communicated through mechanisms such as the 3-minute thesis competition, 2 multidisciplinary panels at mission-driven agencies often have the best chance of getting their work funded. Big data is a reality. Everywhere you look, we're surrounded by big data. I want to tell you that if I had time, I would spend more time talking with you about sort of the hidden ethical challenges from my point of view around big data and the real importance of helping our students actually tackle what privacy means and under what circumstance. Intellectual risk-taking, I think I have to do very high level, but here goes. I would say that scientific review panels are essentially conservative. They require that 60% of the work already be completed before you get the next tranche of work to continue. With the exception of places like DARPA and a few others, the investment is in a particular specific project, which is almost completed at the point it's funded. And there's very little room for total exploration. think this is a real challenge to our students, as well as to our faculty colleagues. And again, for all the reasons I mentioned, global competencies will be hugely important as our students navigate the terrain of working across nation states and languages. Well, at this point, I'm really going to now try to shorten the conversation. Any one of these things we could talk about for some time, but I'm going to end with this summary, and then you can challenge me and ask me if you want to talk about it more. And that's the next slide. I'm going to simply make the case that what I'm suggesting, what we're really asking, is that researchers of the future will need to be better systems thinkers. They really need to understand the relationship between the disciplines. They really have to have a good sense of how their project or their work is affected by the organizational context in which they are deployed. They have to have a deep sense of the various components of the innovation ecosystem, which means funders, which means tech transfer, which means basic bench science, which means clinical trials. It means the entire system, including the graduate education enterprise itself. It will require real flexibility, capacity to be agile and move across these various boundaries. And I want to end with a final point, which is really on my heart and on my mind these days. It is a fundamental attribute of systems thinking. And that is that our students really need to be aware of or think about the downstream impact of the science and technology they produce. Who does it serve, and whose needs does it perhaps fail to address? Okay, I've laid out a bunch of challenges. We need systems thinkers. We need we need quasi-philosophers. We need people with the skills to work across complicated and dynamic teams speaking perhaps different cultural languages, but certainly different disciplinary languages. Now, how in the world are we, we'll start with we as faculty members, going to help our students get there? Of course, professional development is a huge piece of the puzzle. And the good news from the pandemic is that as universities have shifted to virtual delivery of professional development offerings on anything from dissertation boot camps to project management to preparing future faculty or engaging with virtual pedagogies, my dean colleagues report higher levels of participation than they've ever had. I want to say, and I'm going to show you a couple data slides about professional development, that there is enormous recognition on the part of alumni of a wide range of skills that they value and know that they need in order to be successful. They include leadership development, they include critical thinking, they include multiculturalism, they include digital literacy, quantitative analyses. I'm going to give you a set of links to some documents that'll give you the data I'm talking about. We know a lot about what kind of professional development is very useful. We know that students recognize, alums recognize that the earlier they engage in professional development, the better off they are. There's a few things that can wait till closer to the end of a graduate career, specifically leadership development, entrepreneurship training, actual CV preparation and interviewing skills can wait a little later. But a lot of the work developing important professional networks, multicultural awareness and other issues really need to happen early. I thought I had a slide that was going to show you this, but it's interesting, and this is an interesting note. We just published our research brief on what we know about professional development, and I don't know what you would have guessed is the major reason for people who said something would have been important but didn't take it, what the major reason they said they didn't take it was. I'm guessing some of you think, well, they said they were too busy. Some of you might be thinking, oh, my advisor wouldn't want me to take time away from the lab. I mean, there were quite a few. I mean, you can imagine the litany, but far and away, these alums said we didn't take it because we didn't know if or whether it was offered. And we know for certain that on many of these campuses, there are professional offerings. So this question of how do you make sure that students hear about the opportunities at a time when they're prepared to take it, and how do we demonstrate its relevance, I think is the new challenge that CGS is going to take up, and see if we can help provide any good advice. Well, okay, on to the I think it's almost the last slide, and then to conversation. I want to ask this question. So we know professional development is important, but I want to also suggest that we can't create the scientists and scholars we need simply by adding more and more and more workshops onto an already very demanding educational experience. And how can and should we begin thinking about how the curriculum might change, and how the capstone projects that we expect, specifically dissertations, might change. I think there are a lot of different ways we can think about this. Certainly broader scale adoption of project-based assignments focused on solving, we'll call them wicked problems, is one strategy. Certainly case and community-based learning. An expanded notion of internships. And yes, I think we're learning something about what is and isn't possible in a virtual internship environment. And certainly introduction of concepts like design thinking, where projects and technologies begin with the end in mind. There's a lot of really interesting work beginning to happen in the space around dissertations, some of it quite bold and suggested by the 2018 National Academies report that asked, why couldn't we have collaborative dissertations? That's what most scientists will do when they are done. They're going to publish collaborative research. How could we make that happen? But I want to start with a few ideas that could help, but are not, I think, fundamentally upending. So, for example, why is it impossible to imagine that we could include experts on our dissertation committees that come from the private sector, or perhaps from communities broadly impacted by the reach of the project? What about asking students to provide a lay abstract to their dissertation? Something that explains in the NSF 250-word format why a reader should really care about the science and the results. What about an epilogue, a 6th chapter to a dissertation that asks a student to explicitly outline the broader impacts for business perhaps, or for pedagogy, or for the community itself of the work, that really asks them to go through the process of thinking about the broader implications of this work? What about in the humanities, engaging university presses, scholarly press editors in the formulation of humanities monographs? Since we know that what's published is incredibly important to tenure, but that what's published is changing. I would commend to you all a very, very thoughtful white paper on the future of a dissertation. It is available through the University of Wisconsin. It's one of the smartest pieces I've seen. Bill Karpus says they've adopted some of the policies, and some they're just kind of plugging on. They let them sit and then they come back and revisit them. It really challenges us to think, should we and how can we appropriately change the nature of the curriculum itself, and not solely rely on professional development. Well, because I know there are students here, and I've been talking a lot to faculty and deans, I want to spend at least a couple moments talking about advice for students. So next slide, please. I really, really want to encourage students to take an active, take advantage of and actively participating in their mentoring. Mentoring is a two-way relationship. There is indeed a power differential in that relationship, but students, you have more power than you think. And most of your mentors are well-intentioned. If your university makes use of the individual development plans, I would strongly encourage you to engage with your faculty member, even if you don't use it as a real tool to guide your activities, but simply as a heuristic that reminds you of the kinds of things that will be important. It is a very meaningful exercise. Make sure to learn what professional opportunities your university offers. I guess this is not just on students. I think it's on all of us. We've got to make sure that students understand where they can seek and what kinds of opportunities they can seek. Again, the earlier the better. That's all the advice that comes from your peers and your peers, recent alumni peers. Seek out opportunities to develop broader skills, and most especially seek out multiple supportive mentors. Network with people whose work interests you. Ask questions about how's your career evolved? What do you enjoy about your job? I mean, I know in the sciences, many of us are relatively introverted, and the whole idea of walking up to somebody and striking up a conversation is a little daunting. So just ask your mentor to set you up with somebody they think you'd be interested in talking about, and that makes it a little less scary. Again, I want to point you to the fact that these broad sets of skills are seen as widely valuable in getting a first job. Again, communication, public speaking, networking, digital literacy are important across all fields. In fact, 95% of alums say these were extremely important in their fields. Grant writing is important in all fields, maybe a little more important for those who hold faculty jobs than those who don't, but figuring out how you're going to get money to support the projects you care about is always important in any context. Multicultural skills are important. And if you really can't get everything done at once, the best advice, as I said, is that preparing for job interviews, entrepreneurship, leadership development are things that reasonably could come later. Now, one of my favorite events of the entire year is the 3MT thesis. So this really is the last slide. If those of you, it's going to pop. I think this is one that's animated. So how cute is that? We recently had our 3MT competition, the purpose of which is really to give students an opportunity to practice some of the skills we've been talking about, to in a very distilled way explain both the science and the why and who should care about projects that are funded, after all, by taxpayers. So Megan LaFollette from Purdue University did a project on tickling rats for superior science, arguing that when rats aren't stressed, you get a better read of the pharmacological properties of medicines you're trying to study. And you have to say it's pretty adorable, but incredibly important science as well. Allison Mercer Smith. Next up, I think, John. From the University of Chapel Hill, talked about both her own personal experience as a young woman with ovarian cancer that was detected early, and she's doing well, and how that led her to examining how you could turn skin cells into cancer killers. What was so remarkable about Allison is her conversation about how she got involved in this kind of work, because as an MD, PhD, she wanted to be better able to communicate with her patients about the science and the treatment prognosis that she was offering them. And finally, Masa Lotfi Marchuba from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, did a project on very miniaturized neural probes for simultaneous detection of chemicals in the brain, something really important and trying to address problems from epilepsy to schizophrenia. So if you haven't participated in the 3MT, that is a live link at the bottom of this screen, and you will get these slides in a PDF, and you'll be able to use the links. It's a wonderful experience listening to students talk about their work with energy and enthusiasm. If you have not yet encouraged a student, or students, if you have not yet asked, how can I get involved? I would strongly encourage you to participate. It is a wonderful mechanism for bringing together many of these different skills around communication, about multiculturalism, about very fine science and analysis, to be the change we wish to be in the world. So with that, I'm going to close. I hope we have a few minutes left. These are all resources that are available to you. Again, these will all have hot links. Any of them, I think you might find many of them of interest. So we'd be delighted for you to make use of them. Again, we will send this in a form you can distribute Ambica soon. And I am open for questions. I think we have a few minutes for some.
Okay, well, that was wonderful, Suzanne. It's but the whole challenge that you posed, I think, is really important for all of us. So appreciate your interest in your time and the discussion we're going to have. I see a lot of people who are not shy wallflowers, I'm sure, ready to ask questions. I'm going to, Janice Bush, who's Associate Dean in the College of Sciences, has posted a question, so I'm going to turn it over to her for the first.
Yeah, my question was, how do we convince our faculty colleagues to buy into these broader objectives when we all think our specialty is what we need to focus on in our program objectives?
I guess I think it's going to be two or threefold effort. For me, the data are pretty clear. We know what students are saying they need. We know that their career trajectories look nothing like ours. The exercise of asking in my department, I mean, it's pretty easy for colleagues to say, yeah, I know it's like that everywhere else, but all of my students go on to research universities. I mean, we have this remarkable way of remembering the ones who didn't, forgetting everybody else. So I always say start with, even if it's not a perfect, start with a look at what's happened with the last 2 or 3 cohorts of your students. Where are they? I would strongly recommend, if you possible, to invite those alums back to talk both to their faculty mentors and their current students. So making sure that faculty understand exactly where their students are going, I think is hugely important. I will tell you that I see in this change in current students thinking about jobs another pressure point on faculty, because in point of fact, faculty do respond to student interests and will, in fact, mostly because I think they want to, but when the good students only want to work with people who will help them get where they want to be, there's another incentive. And I think students are beginning to come with that kind of expectation. Again, I would say there are many national organizations, disciplinary ones, as well as ones like CGS, that are creating resources and trying to create the conversation and the human interest stories that illustrate that good work happens all over the place. And then if you can find one Nobel laureate who believes passionately, this will help persuade a certain number of colleagues, and they're around, by the way.
So we have an example actually in the audience here, David Silva, who came from a non-academic career and is now dean of a college. So David, do you want to chime in?
Sure. I saw Emily had her hand up, so I was going
Oh,
to give
I'm
her
sorry,
I was
Emily.
going to give Emily the floor before I
I-
jumped in.
I apologize, Emily. I didn't see the hand up.
Hi. So quick background. I am a PhD student in physics and astronomy, but I already hold a professional science master's from the Applied Industrial Math program, also at UTSA. In my experience, the benefits of returning to grad school after some years in the workplace, whether it's in the field or not, are really extraordinary. But I have never, about 10 years after I graduated undergrad in 2003, I went back and a professor suggested I look at professional science masters. And that was really helpful to me. But I've never heard any idea of a path forward for people who want to wait and go to grad school later. But I actually think, I mean, my honest opinion is that basically almost everybody should wait and go back later. And I think that there should be at least a discussion of that, not just being okay as long as you can prove yourself to be as good as the people who went right away, but actually desirable. I'd be interested to hear opinions about that, as well as any idea of how students can be shown that that could be an option. Because my experience has always been either you go to grad school out of undergrad or you can't hack it. And maybe later you try to change your mind about that. So I'm just interested in that discussion.
If I think Gilberto wants to say something, but could I say just two things first? One of our big NSF projects right now is showing absolutely an increase in the number of students in undergraduate pipeline programs. So they're being groomed to go to graduate school who say they will be taking a gap year or years off. And you know, there's no reason to quarrel with that. I mean, if your life is disrupted and you're dealing with ill health and job loss and family obligations, it's pretty hard to say, oh, no, as a mentor, no, you must go. But here's what I'm really, really worried about. We don't have good infrastructure for keeping track of those students and for reminding them that we remain interested and that there are on-ramps. So I can tell you, I just wrote an article in our newsletter that really talked about that. I feel very, very passionately about that. And I also feel very passionately about the fact that it is, I mean, I was trying to imagine. So suppose somebody has been out of school for 5 years. They were a great undergraduate student, but maybe they didn't do undergraduate research because maybe they were there during COVID. And they're not paying too much attention. The graduate school isn't paying too much attention to GREs because now I don't have to go back and study, you know, whatever it is, geometry. But how are you going to get 3 letters from faculty members who know you well when you've been gone for 5 years? And who's going to accept letters from your pastor or your boss? I mean, I think there's so many things we need to think. Emily, thank you for raising that question because I think this is a huge one for us right now. And Beek, I think Gilberto wanted to say something.
She's muted.
She's muted. Gilberto, can you unmute, please?
Muted. I put everything on the back burner for 20 years. When my husband retired from the Air Force and we retired here in San Antonio and went back to school and I finished my BA. And then one of my professors pushed me and says, you have to continue with your master's. And I said, you have to be kidding. At my age, I was 60 by then. Well, he pushed me and it took me 5 years because I did it very slowly, but I did it. And he has been pushing me for my PhD and I say, I'm too old for that, forget it. So he quit. But I've been teaching at UTSA 15 years. I did my master's at 65. And I always tell my students, better than like never. If you need a break, take it, but don't forget it. Keep at it until, you know. So I just wanted to share that because I think it's weird. Anyway, thank you.
So I do see another question in the chat. One,
David.
I'm just going to read it out while he unmutes. In the case of international students, what would you recommend them to do in the early stage of their professional career towards having success in this country?
I think I would recommend that they do many of the same things I would recommend US students do. That is to develop first a cohort of friends and colleagues. I think the particular challenge for our international students is when in an environment that's totally new, it's hard to find both US speaking and English speaking students who are equally embracing, probably more comfortable to talk with others from your country. And I think we need to do a better job of making sure that there are social opportunities for our international students to have a truly US American graduate education experience. So that would be piece one. Piece number two is that most professional development opportunities are almost as relevant for students who may go back home as they are for those who would stay here. And if they're going to stay here through OPT and others, the kinds of approaches, the sort of sensitivities about cultural context is as important for them as anybody else in navigating terrain that you didn't grow up in. So I think my bottom line is going to be, if we can figure out ways to make sure that US graduate students benefit from the wisdom and the experience of international students, and we can help our international students really have the experience they thought they came to America to have, will be a long way towards improving relationships with other nations and to creating a truly global advanced labor force.
Okay, so I am going to give David an opportunity for 30 seconds or a minute. And I know
Yeah.
Suzanne then has to leave.
Yeah, I'll keep it really short. Thanks. That was an awesome talk. I really resonated with a lot of the things you said. I could pick many of the things, but I'm going to pick up on the collaborative issue and working in group work. I mean, if you, as Ambika mentioned, I really have spent most of my career off campus, although I kind of had my one foot in the water still. But I've also spent, I think, as I look around in the workforce of, people I know off campus, I look at the way people are being trained in big experimental astrophysics and physics, which is my home field. It's all collaborative right now. And I think, you get a lot of the things you're talking about through that collaborative space, because you're not only working with people in your discipline, you're also working with people from other allied disciplines. You're working with technicians and engineers in, electrical engineers, or you're working with data scientists, or, you maybe actually have to get to know about, God forbid, working with, non-scientists and non-academics as part of your team. And it's, and you even get that multicultural. I mean, I've had I think in those big collaborations, you can actually end up working with people from outside of the US, which or there's not a person from outside the US who's, one of your cohort who's in a collaboration. And so I would like to see people embrace that big project approach as the framework or environment for training graduate students, at least in STEM. I think that getting away from STEM is outside of my sphere of expertise. But it goes so counter to what I see a lot of still within my own college here at UTSA is many people are still very much trapped in the apprentice model, and which has existed since, I don't know, Oxford in the 1500s or something like that. So it's, I think that's the challenge. I think that's one of the challenges, is getting people to just, if they want to train their students the best, give them a more richer experience, and just than just keeping them locked in their lab for 3 years.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Suzanne, again. We really appreciate your time and for challenging us. And hopefully this will get a discussion going on campus on how to reimagine graduate education.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I look forward to our next opportunity to actually be someplace and have a conversation. So you all take care and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending as well. And stay tuned for our next set. Bye-bye.